welcome to the Art of Being Human. We've been dealing with bereavement, grief and bereavement, and we're still going to do that for maybe 3 or 4 more sessions, and then we'll go on into suicidology, because grief and bereavement and suicidology are so combined together, and there is such an upswing in the amount of people who are trying to commit suicide. It seems like a natural thing that we need to do. So for now, we're still dealing with death and bereavement and the experience of grief and how to get through that experience. I ran into a segment, actually it ran into a paragraph or so that was printed on the internet. And suppose, I'm going to read it to you, but I've shortened it some, so you're not getting the whole thing, but you're getting the gist of it. And it's supposedly a person who was passed on and what they would write to a person who's still living and have not passed on. So it's a message from the dead to the living, in a sense. And it may be a perspective that may help you if you're going through grief. It may or may not help you. I've never read anything quite like it before, and I'm not even sure how I feel about it. But this is what it says. This is, if you can pretend that a person who has passed on is writing this. Death is nothing at all. It does not count. I have only slipped away into the next room. Nothing has happened. Everything remains exactly as it was. I am I, and you are you, and the old that we lived so fondly together is unchanged. Whatever we were to each other, we still are. Call me by the old familiar name. Speak of me in the old familiar way you used to laugh at. Laugh as we used to laugh at the little jokes. Let my name be a household word. Let it be spoken with no effort. Life means all that it ever meant. There is a continuity. Why should I be out of mind because I am out of sight? I am waiting for you somewhere near, just around the corner. All is well. Now, I don't know if you find that comforting or not, but it does present to us the idea that there is a continuity to life. Life just doesn't end. Now, I still do funerals, even though I'm retired. I do occasionally do funerals, and I do a lot of teaching. And in a funeral, I will say, you know, supposing you're the person that's going to pass on. Well, you're driving a car. You switch the gears, you change lanes, you move ahead without stopping. You're now in a different place. You're not really gone. You're not annihilated. You're just in a different place. And that helps people to conceptualize the possibility of an afterlife. I do believe in an afterlife, and many, many people do. So that's not unusual. And the value of this article, if you choose to think that way, is the fact that there is a continuity. What would a person who has passed on write for advice to a person that they love that was still here that had not passed on yet? What would they say? Would they say, think of me in the same way as you did? I'm still me. You're still you. Laugh at the same jokes. Call me by name like you used to. You know, no frowns or anything. Just life goes on. Now, I want to read to you, and I don't know, this isn't a religious show, but I wanted to read to you a verse of Scripture, and it comes from Hebrews 12, 22 through 25. Now, bear in mind, I'm not trying to make this into a show on religion, but since we are dealing with spiritual things in the afterlife, this might be helpful to you. It's in the New Testament. It's in Hebrews 12, 20 through to 25. It's not too long, and I'll just read it to you. And what I want you is to get that sense of continuity between life, and even if a person is passed on, they're still alive somewhere, and hopefully a much, much healthier, happier place. So this is what it says. But you have come to Mount Zion, and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to a judge who is God of all, and to the spirits of the just made perfect, and to Jesus the mediator. And it goes on from here, but that's the only part of it that I'm going to read. And it might give you the sense of continuity. It's phrased differently in different versions, but it says you're coming to Mount Zion. And Mount Zion is a mountain in Jerusalem, but you're coming to the mountain. Some people have passed on. Some people are still not at the top of the mountain. And there is a company of angels, very joyous angels there, and the righteous are there. So it's like life continues. There is another life, and life continues, and it will help you with your grief if you truly do believe this. Now, I can't tell you what to believe. I'm only presenting you with some ideas. It is within yourself to accept or not to accept whether there is an afterlife or not. And I really don't want to get into that because of the fact that I'm dealing with death and grief and bereavement and how to get through that. But it does add a different element to your experience if you are a believer, if you do believe that there is an afterlife. It does add a different element to your experience of grief. I think those who do have a concept of the fact that there is an afterlife have an easier time of grief, and I think their healing is faster because they do believe that the individual is not really gone. I know now when I do funerals, and I speak at funerals, and I still do funerals, I usually take a segment, a little segment, not long, because I don't think a funeral has to be long to be meaningful, but I take a little segment of the funeral, and I'll say, okay, this is the grief process that you are now in. This is what you're feeling. This is what you're experiencing, and that you can heal from that. And this is how you heal, and I kind of go into that a little bit. As I say, it's not long, and I go on into knowing how you're healing. How can you tell when you're healing and that your grief is going to subside at some point? And so I do a little section. And the last the last funeral that I did was for a doctor of mine who I hadn't seen in 20 years. He'd retired, he'd moved on, then he got cancer, and he moved back. And he decided he wanted me to do his funeral because he knew he wasn't going to make it. And he hadn't seen me for over 20 years, and I hadn't been in contact with him because I'd moved on as well. Usually if you move on, you don't necessarily keep contact with your physicians. You have new physicians. But he contacted me, or he set in motion a plan where I could be reached because he didn't know where I was. And I was reached, and I did do the funeral. And it was significant because it's the only funeral I've ever done where the people came out smiling. And one person said to me, "You told us everything we need to know, and you did not leave anything out." And I'm assuming what they meant was the fact that I went into the healing process for the grief as part of the funeral. And I wish more people did this, and I'm going to continue to do it because it does seem to be helpful. So getting back to the losses and the different types of losses we experience, I'm going to put that, what I talked about, to one side for a moment, and I'm going to talk about different types of losses that you wouldn't expect. We all know that death happens. We go through the grief process. I've gone through the stages with you, and I've discussed various things with you. But what are the special types of losses that you don't expect, but they still happen, that makes grief worse? It makes it more difficult to cope with. Well, for example, there are several of them. But for the first one I want to discuss is the unexpected death of a child. Nobody expects a child to die. It's a parent's worst nightmare if they're predeceased by their children. They expect that their children will take care of them in their final hours, not the other way around. Now, it always brings depression, and it always brings, for some people, such depression that people are unresponsive, and there's no vitality, and they withdraw from relationships with other people because they are so absorbed in the mourning of grieving this child that has died. The world seems unreal. The mother feels impoverished. So you get to expect several things to happen when a person is in mourning because they've lost a child. It's very, very difficult. Now, I know sometimes a child will die in utero. A mother will give birth to a child that dies at birth or has died in her womb before it is born. And I know the usual thing is to tell the mother, well, you didn't get a chance to know the child, and you can always get pregnant again, and it's not such a terrible loss as if the child had grown up to be 4 or 5 years old and then you lost them. But none of those statements are helpful at all, because for a female, the way that they bond with babies, as soon as they're pregnant, they know it. And as soon as the baby starts to develop, they can feel it. And it's not like it's painful or anything, but they are aware that they're carrying somebody. And they do feel, excuse me, they do feel bonded to that child. So even if the baby has not yet been born, there is a bonding there that goes on between the mother and the child, or the mother toward the child. And so if they lose an unborn baby, it's a regular loss, just like losing a family member, because it is a family member. And you don't know maybe even if the child is male or female, but the fact is there is a human being, and the mother's carrying her human being, her baby. And as a result of that, the grief can be very, very strong. It is a loss of a child. Excuse me, this is hay fever season. For some reason, in sudden death, there is no preparation, and that makes it an extremely difficult time for anyone who's suffering through it, especially if it's a parent and they're going through the death of a child. It makes it very different. And it's also, if you know that you're going to pass on and you're diagnosed with something that you didn't expect you had, and it's a surprise to you, that little lump turned out to be a massive cancer, that little place on your skin is going to go through your system very quickly, you've had no chance to prepare for your own death, and you have to go through death stages as well. It makes it very difficult. And a lot of times, there's no time to bargain. A lot of times, if a person knows they're going to pass on, they will bargain with God. If you let me do this, I will serve you. If you'll just save my health, and I'll be a better Christian, or I'll be a better person. There's no time for preparation. If a death comes quickly, what if you're in an accident? And you know that you're very severely injured. You're conscious enough to know that you're very severely injured, but you know also that you might not make it. You may not actually live. What kind of preparation do you have then to pass on? I think your total focus is based on help me live, help me live. And I don't think you're thinking of eternal consequences or anything like that. I think the focus on, I'm injured, how do I get well? And that's what your focus is, because truthfully, nobody knows when they're going to pass on. But these can be unexpected and sudden deaths, which are very difficult. Now, another category is death from SIDS. SIDS stands for Sudden Infant Death Syndrome. And I had one of my little nieces who had SIDS, and they had to watch her, they had to monitor her, they put sound devices on her, and if she stopped breathing, alarms went off, and they would go in and they'd shake her a little, and she'd stop breathing again. I think in some of these infant deaths because of SIDS, that the body is not yet developed enough to breathe on its own completely, and the body forgets to breathe. And if the body forgets to breathe, then of course naturally you're going to die from that, or a baby's going to die from that. So there's a lot of unexpected deaths. Another thing, miscarriage. A mother, and I've mentioned this before, a mother who thinks she's going to have a child and the child dies in utero, or the child dies as a result of the birth process or during the birth process, that's a sudden and unexpected death. And there's not a full recognition maybe of what's been lost, but something's been lost. And the person will go through a grief process, the mother will go through a grief process just exactly like she would have if the baby was at full term and lived to be 2 or 3 years old and then died. For some reason, people get the idea, and it's a false idea, that if the baby has grown up, so it's a few years old, the grief is more difficult than if the baby is still in your uterus, or you've just given birth to a baby, because you haven't gotten the chance to know the baby. But that's a false idea. As soon as the woman is pregnant, and I know I've said it before, but it bears repeating, as soon as the mother is pregnant, then she is going to be bonding with that baby. That's her baby. And nothing's going to replace that. And if that baby is lost, it's her baby that's lost. And the grief process is going to be the same and just as difficult as if the child was 11 years old and died in an accident or something like that. So that's another problem, another different and unexpected deaths. Also, deaths from drugs. We're seeing it more and more. And I'm going to, after this whole segment of grief and bereavement is over with, and after I go through the suicidology, I may go into drugs. What happens in drugs? How to prevent drug use? What happens in bereavement during a drug situation? If you don't know your child because suddenly they're acting differently because they're on drugs, that's a whole different grief process, because it's not just death that causes grief. There's loss and there's change, and there's all kinds of other things that also cause grief. And the grief can be very profound. I mean, if I lost a pet, I would be just as grief-stricken as if I lost something else or somebody else. You know, if I lost a job that I loved, if I had to move and go away and I didn't want to do that, excuse me, it would be just the same thing. It would be grief. There's all kinds of things that cause grief because, truthfully, any kind of loss can cause grief. And the grief can be profound, even if it's not a human being, even if it's a pet, even if it's a job situation, even if it's moving, or you lost your house to foreclosure, whatever it is, whatever there is a loss, there is a grief that follows. Now, I want to mention abortion. There is a profound grief in abortion because the mother, even though the baby hasn't been born yet, has, in her estimation, killed her own baby. And the grief can be very, very profound in that. One of the arguments against abortion, and I'm totally against abortion, but one of the arguments against it is the grief of the mother. She's taken the life of her own child. She's not seen the child except maybe in scans, but she's taken the life of her child. It's a difficult thing to get over. It is healable if you go to a counselor that is specialized in grief counseling, and I am. I mean, I'm not looking for anyone to come to me for this because there are a lot of counselors that are specialized in grief counseling, but it is a healable grief, and they have to feel that, you know, that they've done something terrible, or they caused the death of another person, or they caused a fire or something, or they caused an accident and a person died, you know, and they feel that depth of responsibility. A lot of times we feel responsible for things that we're not responsible for. A person dies and we blame ourselves when we're not to blame. But in the case of abortion, or in the case of murder, or in the case of something where we were directly involved, the grief is more profound because, in a sense, we were responsible for it. But that does not make it unhealable. It is still healable, and it is still forgivable. You just need to seek out the help that you need to help you get through that. Now, moving can be a problem because it disrupts relationships with people that you know and people that you care about. It disrupts your relationships with your friends. And one study shows that 26% of women go into a deep depression because of a move. I suppose a move across country, a move for a different job, requiring that you move. It's just, it's a terrible thing to have that kind of a loss because you feel the loss of your friends. And just look at it this way. A person who you have lost because they have died, a relative or a friend of yours that have died, you have lost them. But as they approach death, they realize that they're going to lose everything. They will have no connection with their friends or no connection with anything that they've ever done. All is lost in that sense, just speaking from a human sense. And so that makes it difficult, too, to be able to go through grief. So both the person who is going to die and the person who has passed on and left people behind, both groups of people have got to deal with the grief that follows that. So I'm going to be going into suicide in a little while. So I'm going to start out next time about how to help children who have been traumatized by the suicide death of their friends and what happens in grief due to suicide. This is not the segment of suicidology that I'm going to be doing, but it has to do with the complicated grief that occurs when a suicide occurs. But I don't have time to really do that now, so we're going to be doing that next time. So we'll close it here. Please join me next time. And I do have the telephone numbers up for the Veterans and Crisis and Suicide Hotline. Take those numbers down if you need them or if your friends need them, 273-8255. And the Domestic Violence Hotline for the state of New Hampshire, 664-3574. So we'll close it here. Please join me next time.